Why was the mud so cold that morning? And why did it feel less like dirt and more like a verdict? Astria Roads couldn't answer that yet. All she knew was that the weight of a man's boot pressed against her shoulder, grinding her cheek deeper into the wet ground as 40 pairs of eyes stood frozen around her. The chill seeped through her uniform, through her skin, all the way to something deeper, something that had nothing to do with temperature. This, General Varick snarled above her, voice sharp and deliberate, is why women don't belong in elite units. The words weren't new. She had heard variations of them whispered in hallways, written between lines of reports, even laughed out loud in briefing rooms. But here, on the training field of Fort Callister, they were more than an insult. They were a statement, a declaration, delivered with the weight of authority and the satisfaction of centuries of unchallenged tradition. And they were meant to break her. The recruits watched, unsure if they were witnessing a lesson or a warning. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared as the general, a man whose medals gleamed brighter than the morning sun, crushed the body and spirit of a single woman into the mud. But something shifted behind Astria's eyes. Not anger, not defeat, something colder, calmer, calculated. When he finally stepped back and barked an order for her to stand, she moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. The small tremors of adrenaline in her muscles steadied. Her breathing evened. She rose from the ground with no visible defiance, but no submission either. And when Varick came at her again, arrogance in every step, the impossible happened. A subtle pivot, a calculated redirect. And then the earth-shaking silence of a general's body hitting the same mud where he had tried to humiliate her. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. It was supposed to be a demonstration of dominance. It became something else, something no one on that field could yet name. Hours earlier, the base had been quiet. Dawn crept over Fort Callister in pale gray streaks, stretching across the jagged landscape of one of the toughest military training grounds in the world. Mist curled around the edges of the obstacle course, ghost-like and heavy, while frost bit at the recruits' faces as they formed up on the field. Fort Callister wasn't just a training base, it was a crucible, a place designed to break bodies and rebuild warriors. Its reputation was legendary: brutal exercises, relentless mental pressure, and a failure rate so high that most never made it past the first month. Astria stood among them, one of only 3 women in a unit of 40. Her uniform was spotless, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. Nothing about her drew attention, no insignia, no scars, no indication that she was anything other than another hopeful candidate trying to prove she belonged. And yet there was something in her eyes. Focus, control, a kind of quiet awareness that felt out of place among the jittery, exhausted faces of the others. Morning, maggots. General Varick's voice sliced through the dawn. He strode across the field with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged, and never expected to be. The scar across his cheek, the rows of medals on his chest, the commanding weight of his presence, all of it spoke of decades spent climbing through the unforgiving machinery of war. 14 of you are still here who should have quit weeks ago, he barked, packing slowly. His eyes stopped on Astria, lingering longer than necessary. The disdain in his gaze wasn't subtle. Some of you are only here because the Pentagon wants to play social justice warrior with our combat readiness. Snickers rippled through the line. A few male recruits exchanged smirks, confident they were witnessing the beginning of an inevitable humiliation. Astria didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on a point far beyond Varick, her face as calm as still water. And that infuriated him more than anything. Today, he announced, we see who deserves to wear the patch. Hand-to-hand combat assessment. No weapons, no excuses. The order came sharp and simple: Roads, front and center. There it was, the challenge everyone had been waiting for. Astria stepped forward without hesitation. She stood before Varick with her hands loose at her sides, posture balanced, eyes steady. The other recruits formed a wide circle around them, a living arena. Their expressions ranged from eager to uneasy. "Rules of engagement, General?" she asked. "Rules?" Varric laughed, loud and theatrical. "Combat has no rules, but I'll go easy on you. Stay standing for 30 seconds. The fight began fast. Varric lunged, not with the controlled precision of an instructor, but with the confident aggression of a man certain of his superiority. Astria blocked and countered with textbook technique, competent but unremarkable. It was what they expected, disciplined training, nothing more. "This what they teach women now," he sneered, slipping past her guard and forcing her back a step. "How to look pretty while getting your butt handed to you." Laughter rippled again, but it was quieter now. The fight wasn't entertainment anymore. It was uncomfortable. It was personal. A sweep of his leg sent her crashing to the ground. Mud splashed across her pristine uniform. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was her place beneath him. 22 seconds, he said, boot landing on her shoulder as she tried to rise. Not even close to combat ready. His weight pressed harder. "Stay down, Roads, know your place." The field was silent. Even those who'd been grinning moments ago shifted uneasily. This wasn't training anymore. It was humiliation. But in the mud, something flickered in Astria's eyes again, that same cold calculation. She wasn't beaten. She was deciding. "Permission to continue the exercise, General?" she asked calmly. The laughter returned, but weaker this time. Varric stepped back, mocking. "Still think you've got something to prove? Fine. Let's see what else they taught you." She rose slowly, deliberately. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to those who noticed it was everything. Her stance wasn't the same. Her movements had a new rhythm, fluid and economical, the kind that came from years of experience, not basic training drills. "Ready when you are," she said. Varric charged again, and this time everything changed. She sidestepped with precision, letting his momentum carry him forward. A redirect, a pivot, a recovery, nothing flashy, nothing theatrical, but undeniably effective. Some of the recruits recognized the technique. Advanced close-quarters combat training, not something a rookie should know. Varric's face tightened. He pressed harder, striking faster, but Astria was no longer reacting, she was controlling. Every movement he made was turned against him, every ounce of aggression redirected. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, stepping back, sweat now forming on his brow. "Standard training, sir," she replied evenly. He didn't believe her, neither did anyone else. His patience broke. Bull. The next attack wasn't a drill. It was a fight. He came at her with full force, intent on crushing her beneath his weight and anger. But Astria didn't meet strength with strength. She shifted again, stance changing into something only seen in specialized units. And then, in one fluid motion, she redirected his charge and sent him crashing face first into the mud. Silence, pure, absolute silence. The same ground where she had been humiliated now swallowed the general whole. He rose, red-faced and trembling with rage. "You're finished, Roads," he spat. "Pack your bags, you're out." But his threat hung hollow in the air. Something fundamental had changed. The room no longer belonged to him. "Stand down, General Varric." Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Calm, controlled, commanding. He stepped into the circle with the authority of a man who had seen this coming all along. "Roads," he said, "identify yourself properly for the unit." The recruits frowned, confused. But Astria's posture changed instantly, crisp, formal, unshakable. "Captain Astria Roads," she declared. "5th Special Forces Group, Combat Applications Specialist. Currently assigned to the Pentagon's Combat Integration Assessment Task Force." The air shifted. Whispers rippled through the formation. Dawson's jaw dropped. Latimer blinked like he'd been struck. Every assumption, every insult, every snide remark disintegrated in the space of a heartbeat. This wasn't a recruit. This was an elite operator, a decorated combat veteran, a woman who had been playing by their rules until they revealed who they really were. And now they were the ones being evaluated. Thorne stepped forward, voice level. Captain Rhodes has been embedded with your unit for the past 3 weeks as part of a comprehensive review of elite training programs. Her assignment was known only to myself and base command. The silence deepened. This was not humiliation, he continued. It was observation, and many of you just failed a test you didn't even know you were taking. Varric's face drained of color. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror at what his actions meant, not just for his career, but for his legacy. Astria stood motionless as Thorne addressed the recruits. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, mud-streaked and unshaken, the embodiment of a truth they could no longer ignore. Strength had never worn a single face. And the lesson had only just begun. Why did silence feel heavier than the mud that morning? It clung to every corner of the training ground, thicker than the fog that once blanketed Fort Callister's fields. 40 recruits stood frozen in formation, but none dared to meet Astria Roads' eyes. The same woman many had mocked hours ago now stood before them not as a recruit, but as a decorated Special Forces officer, a fact that rewrote everything they thought they knew. General Varric's jaw worked furiously, words forming and dying behind clenched teeth. His authority, once unassailable, now hung in tatters. Even the birds that circled above seemed to have fallen silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. "Captain Rhodes," Lieutenant Colonel Thorne said evenly, his gaze sweeping the formation, "has been embedded in this unit for 3 weeks. Her mission was to assess not just training methods, but culture, to see the environment as it truly is, without the filters that come when people know they're being watched." It was a calm statement, but it landed like an artillery shell. Astria remained still, her uniform streaked with mud, her breathing controlled, her posture perfect. She didn't seek the recruits' eyes. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to unearth the shame now creeping across faces that had once sneered at her. Varric, still trembling with rage and humiliation, took a step forward. "Sir, I was not informed." "That was the point," Thorne interrupted, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "An assessment is meaningless if the environment isn't authentic. And authentic," he added, eyes narrowing slightly, "is exactly what we got." Varric's lips pressed into a hard, white line. He knew the implications. He hadn't just humiliated a recruit. He had assaulted and attempted to expel a superior officer conducting an official Pentagon assessment. It was more than misconduct. It was career-ending. "Captain Rhodes," Thorne continued, turning back to her, "has completed this program and far more advanced ones multiple times. She has 3 combat deployments and a Silver Star. She is not here to meet your standards." He paused, letting the words linger in the frigid air. "She's here to determine whether you meet hers." The weight of that reality settled over the recruits like lead. Dawson, who had laughed the loudest at Varric's insults, looked pale. Farah Isaacs, one of the other female recruits, stared at Astria with a mix of awe and guilt. Latimer, who had begun to suspect something earlier, simply nodded to himself, his suspicions now confirmed. Astria's eyes scanned the circle, not with anger, but with the cool detachment of someone who had seen worse and expected more. "Permission to continue with today's training, sir," she said. "Denied," Thorne replied. "I believe today's lesson has been sufficient." Then his attention turned to Varric. "General, my office, now." The general stiffened, his jaw set, but he knew better than to disobey. As he turned and stalked away, the weight of humiliation clinging to his shoulders, the recruits exchanged uneasy glances. The man they had feared most had just been dismantled, not with brute strength, but with discipline, skill, and unshakable composure. And the woman they had underestimated had become something they couldn't ignore, a mirror held up to their failures. The field slowly dissolved into a murmur as the recruits were dismissed. Groups formed small knots of conversation, hushed and uncertain. The hierarchy that once defined this place had shifted. Everything felt off balance. Farah was the first to approach Astria. Her steps were hesitant, her expression conflicted. "You knew," she said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Astria looked at her, face unreadable. "I did." Every insult, every time he said we didn't belong here, Farah's voice wavered. "You just stood there." "My mission wasn't just about General Varick," Astria replied, her tone calm and measured. "It was about the system, the culture, who spoke up, who stayed silent, who found amusement in cruelty." Her words weren't accusatory, just facts, but they landed harder than any rebuke. Farah's eyes dropped to the ground. "And we failed." Astria didn't respond. The silence said enough. Latimer approached next, his usual confidence replaced by a rare humility. "Fifth group, ma'am?" he asked. "My brother served with them in Syria. He mentioned there were some female operators attached, said they were the real deal." Astria's expression softened slightly. "I don't discuss operational details, recruit." "Of course," Latimer nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But thank you for what you did today." She gave a slight nod, the closest thing to gratitude they would get, before turning away. The lesson was already working. The smirks had vanished. The whispered jokes had died. What remained was reflection, uncomfortable, necessary, overdue. A week passed. The morning sun rose over Fort Callister, but the atmosphere was different now. The same field where humiliation once passed for training now buzzed with a sharper, more focused energy. The recruits stood taller. Their movements were crisper. Even the air felt heavier, charged with a newfound seriousness. General Varick was gone. Rumors swirled: reassignment to a frozen outpost in Alaska, early retirement, a disciplinary board. The truth didn't matter. His presence was erased. Colonel Orion, the new instructor, was the antithesis of Varick. Tough, yes, but fair, demanding without cruelty. His drills were brutal, but they served a purpose beyond ego. He built warriors. He didn't break them. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne stood before the formation, flanked by several officers, including Astria, now wearing her full uniform with insignia and decorations. It was the first time most of the recruits had seen her that way, and the effect was striking. "The purpose of elite training is not to destroy soldiers," Thorne began, voice carrying across the silent field. "It's to build them. Somewhere along the way, Fort Callister lost sight of that. Captain Roads' assessment has given us the chance to correct course." His words sank deep. "Standards will not change," he continued. "They will remain as higher even than before, but the methods must. Excellence is not forged through humiliation. It's forged through discipline, through purpose, through resilience." Then he turned to Astria. "Before Captain Roads departs to deliver her final report, I've asked her to say a few words." Astria stepped forward. The recruits, all 40 of them, straightened instinctively. "3 weeks ago," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I arrived here with the same qualifications as many of you. The only difference was perception, yours and sometimes my own." Her gaze swept the formation, pausing on faces that had mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her. "I was judged not by my skills but by assumptions. Assumptions about what I could or could not do because of my gender, because of tradition, because of expectations." A few recruits shifted uncomfortably. Dawson's eyes darted to the ground. "But perception," she continued, "can be deadly. In combat, the enemy doesn't care about your assumptions. Bias blinds you. It makes you miss critical information. It gets people killed. And that tunnel vision, the one that made you underestimate me, is the same tunnel vision that could cost you lives in the field." The words hit like a punch because they weren't just theory. They were truth, hard-earned and undeniable. "The standards of this program should never change," Astria said. But our understanding of who can meet them must. If we want the best fighting force possible, we cannot afford to overlook potential because it doesn't come packaged the way we expect. A heavy silence followed. Then slowly Latimer stepped forward. His voice was crisp, formal. Unit attention. And just like that, 40 recruits snapped into position. One by one, they raised their hands in salute, first Latimer, then Farah, then even Dawson, who hesitated before joining them. The salute wasn't commanded, it wasn't required, it was earned. Astria returned it with perfect precision. What had begun in humiliation ended in respect, not demanded but forged. Weeks later, Astria's mission shifted from the mud of Fort Callister to the marble halls of power. A congressional hearing room buzzed with cameras and whispers as she prepared to testify on the findings of the Combat Integration Task Force. Headlines scrolled across screens. Pentagon overhauls training protocols after Callister incident. New standards set nationwide. Before entering the chamber, Astria ran into Farah again, now wearing the insignia of a soldier who had completed the elite program. Her posture was taller, her eyes brighter. "They're calling it the Roads Standard," Farah said with a smile. 17 women entered the program after you left. 4 of us completed it last month. "And Orion?" Astria asked. "Tough but fair," Farah replied. "The kind of leader who builds warriors, not breaks them." Astria's lips curved into a faint smile. Maybe, she thought, that was the point all along. Back at Fort Callister, a new training cycle began. Men and women stood side by side, equal in numbers, equal in expectations. The mud still clung to boots, the drills still broke bodies, but the spirit of the place had changed. At the edge of the training field, a plaque had been installed where Astria once knelt in humiliation. "Excellence knows no gender, the Roads Standard." It wasn't a monument to a person. It was a promise, a standard to which all who passed through this crucible would now be held. And for Astria Roads, that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it doesn't even demand to be seen. Sometimes dignity simply acts. Why did the weight of silence in the hearing room feel heavier than the weight of any weapon she'd ever carried? Captain Astria Roads had faced gunfire. She had crawled through enemy lines, dragged wounded soldiers out of kill zones, and stared down death more times than she could count. But nothing felt as suffocating as the stillness in that oak-paneled chamber in Washington, D.C., where rows of lawmakers sat beneath the seal of the United States, waiting for her to speak. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes were no less high. Here, the weapon was truth, and the fallout from it could ripple farther than any blast. She adjusted the silver star on her uniform jacket, the weight of its history grounding her. Cameras lined the back wall, red lights blinking. Across the country, soldiers, civilians, skeptics, and believers were watching. Somewhere in a barracks on the other side of the world, a young woman training for her first deployment might be watching too. And if Astria did this right, the ground beneath her, beneath them, could shift forever. "Captain Roads," the committee chair began, a polished man with silver hair and the posture of someone used to commanding rooms. "The floor is yours." Astria stood. She didn't clear her throat or shuffle her notes. She had rehearsed this testimony 100 times in her head, but when she spoke, her words came from someplace deeper, someplace older. 3 weeks undercover at Fort Callister taught me more about our military than 3 deployments ever could, she said, her voice steady but edged with quiet intensity. And what I learned is simple. We are not failing because our standards are too high. We are failing because our definitions are too narrow. A ripple moved through the room, a murmur too faint to break the silence but too loud to ignore. "For decades, we have built our elite units on a foundation of exclusion disguised as tradition," she continued. "We told ourselves we were forging warriors, when too often we were forging arrogance. We mistook humiliation for discipline. We confused cruelty with leadership. and we taught soldiers to underestimate anyone who didn't fit the mold. The words weren't accusatory, they were matter-of-fact surgical, but they cut deep. When General Varick pressed my face into the mud, he wasn't just making a statement about me, Astria said. He was making a statement about what we value, about who we think belongs. And in doing so, he revealed a truth our enemies have always known. A force divided by prejudice is weaker than a force united by purpose. A congresswoman on the panel leaned forward, her pen stilling over her notepad. Captain Rhodes, do you believe this issue is systemic? Astria paused, considering her words. Yes, ma'am, but not in the way many assume. The system doesn't always intend to exclude, but it does so by habit, by culture, by the quiet moments when no one speaks up, by the jokes that go unchallenged, by the promotions given to those who conform rather than those who excel. And the solution, another lawmaker asked. Accountability, Astria said simply. Not just for those who break the rules, but for those who make excuses for them. Training that builds strength without degrading dignity. Leadership that measures worth by skill, not by stereotype. The chair leaned back in his seat, steepling his fingers. And do you believe integration of women into elite combat units is sustainable at the highest levels? Astria met his gaze without hesitation. It's not just sustainable, sir. It's necessary. The battlefield has changed. The threats we face are adaptive, complex, and unconventional. Our forces must be too. Limiting ourselves by outdated notions of who can fight is a luxury we can no longer afford. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. Astria answered questions about policy, culture, and capability. She presented data, not just her own experiences, but decades of overlooked studies showing that diverse units performed better under stress, made better tactical decisions, and demonstrated greater resilience. But the heart of her testimony was not in the statistics. It was in the story of what had happened in that muddy field at Fort Callister, a story that resonated far beyond the chamber walls. When it was over, the committee room erupted in a low buzz of conversation. Some lawmakers nodded thoughtfully, others whispered to aides. The press surged forward. But Astria wasn't thinking about them. Her mind drifted instead to the training ground thousands of miles away, to the recruits who had saluted her that final day, to the plaque that now bore her name, to the young women who might step into that field tomorrow believing, for the first time, that they belonged there. Outside the hearing room, Colonel Everett was waiting. His presence was grounding, a reminder of where she had come from, of who she had been before the headlines and hearings. "You did well," he said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the elevators. "I spoke the truth," Astria replied. "That's harder than it sounds," Everett said, "especially in this town." She gave a small smile. "Do you think it'll change anything?" "It already has," he said. 3 training facilities have quietly removed instructors with similar histories. A 4th has rewritten its entire assessment process, and there's talk of new directives coming down from the Joint Chiefs. Astria exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be the face of this." "Sometimes," Everett said, "the mission finds you." Across the country, the ripple effects of that testimony began to spread. At Fort Callister, the changes were already visible. Recruits now trained under a curriculum designed not just to break down and rebuild bodies, but to challenge minds. Strength was still demanded more than ever, but so was respect. So was discipline. So was character. And for the first time, women and men trained side by side in equal numbers, facing identical standards and identical expectations. Farah Isaacs was one of them, no longer a hesitant recruit, but a graduate of one of the most demanding programs in the military. She had earned her place not because someone lowered the bar, but because someone refused to let prejudice raise it artificially. She still remembered the words Astria had spoken that day in the mud. Who spoke up, who stayed silent. They haunted her, but they also drove her. And now, as she stood on the range with a rifle balanced against her shoulder, she whispered a silent promise: never again. Latimer, too, had changed. He had been among the first to salute Astria, a gesture he once thought would be unthinkable. Now he carried that moment with him into every mission briefing, every patrol, every conversation with younger recruits. Respect, he realized, wasn't something you offered because of gender or rank. It was something earned and recognized. Even Dawson, who had once laughed the loudest, had been humbled. The shame of that day still stung, but it became the foundation of a different kind of soldier, one who questioned his assumptions before they cost lives. The Rhodes Standard wasn't just a plaque on the field. It was a way of thinking, a new measure of what strength meant. Months later, Astria visited Fort Callister again. It wasn't part of her official duties, no inspection, no speech. She just wanted to see it. The field looked the same. The mud was still thick, the air still sharp, the wind still cutting across the open training ground. But something felt different. The recruits were different, the instructors were different, the energy was different. At the edge of the obstacle course, she stopped before the plaque. Excellence knows no gender, the Rhodes Standard. She knelt briefly, brushing her fingers against the cold metal, not as a gesture of pride, but as a quiet acknowledgement of everything it represented: the humiliation, the struggle, the resilience, the change. She thought of the girls watching her testimony from their barracks, of the young men who would grow into leaders shaped by a different kind of strength, of the generations that might never know the mud in the way she had, not because the fight was easier, but because the battlefield had evolved. And for the first time in a long time, Astria felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: hoping. Because the mud hadn't just tried to bury her. It had become the soil from which something stronger could grow. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Astria walked alone along the perimeter fence, boots crunching softly against the gravel. Her mind drifted, as it often did, to the men and women she had served beside, those who never made it home, and those who did but carried invisible scars. Some of them would never see the changes she had helped create. Some would never believe they were possible. But for the ones who came after, the story would be different. Not because one woman had defied a general, but because one moment of humiliation had been transformed into a catalyst for something larger, something that would outlast her name, her rank, even her memory. The mission was far from over. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight. Bias didn't vanish with a hearing, but change had begun. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the smallest fracture in the armor of tradition was all it took to let the light in. Sometimes the most profound revolutions didn't begin with a battle cry. Sometimes they began in the mud. Why did the wind feel so familiar as it cut across the field that morning? And why did it sting like a memory instead of weather? Captain Astria Roads hadn't set foot on Fort Callister soil in almost a year. The mud that had once clung to her uniform and to the lowest moment of her career had long since dried and blown away. But as she stepped onto the training ground once more, the echoes of that day still lived here. They were etched into the soil, stitched into the routines, woven into the way recruits looked at one another now. The plaque near the southern gate gleamed in the early light. Excellence knows no gender, the Rhodes Standard. Some recruits paused to read it on their way to the obstacle course, fingers brushing the edge like a talisman. Others walked past without a glance, but their movements, their posture, their silence told Astria everything. The culture had shifted. The arrogance that once simmered beneath the surface was gone. In its place was something rarer: respect. Earned, mutual, unspoken. And yet for Astria this return wasn't about nostalgia. It was reconnaissance. She was no longer an embedded evaluator, no longer an anonymous recruit hiding in plain sight. Now she was a mission advisor to the Pentagon's Combat Integration Initiative, a new directive that sought to reshape how elite units across the military trained, deployed and operated. Fort Callister, once a symbol of resistance, was now its proving ground. "Ma'am," a voice called out. Astria turned to see Farah Isaacs jogging toward her, now wearing the distinctive patch of a fully qualified operator. She moved differently now, less tentative, more assured. The uncertainty that once haunted her posture was gone, replaced by the measured confidence of someone who had fought for every inch of ground beneath her boots. "Farah," Astria greeted with a rare smile, "you look good in that patch." "Feels good too," Farah said, a grin breaking across her face. "Harder to earn than I ever imagined, but worth every bruise." "And how's Orion?" Astria asked, glancing toward the range, where the new training director paced between squads. "Still terrifying," Farah admitted with a chuckle. "But in the best possible way. He pushes us harder than Varric ever did, but he does it to make us better, not to prove a point." Astria nodded, her eyes scanning the field. Men and women moved side by side, sprinting, climbing, grappling. The difference wasn't in the drills, those were as brutal as ever. It was in the faces, determined, focused, unified. "How many women in this cycle?" she asked. 21 started, Farah said. 9 are still here." Astria raised an eyebrow. 9 out of 21, that's impressive. "It's not because it's easier," Farah said quickly. "If anything, it's harder now. The standards haven't changed." "They shouldn't," Astria said. "The goal was never to lower the bar, only to make sure it wasn't rigged." Farah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There's still resistance, you know, still people who think this is political, but the difference is now they're forced to see us, to compete with us, and sometimes to lose to us." Astria's eyes softened. "They're not losing to women, Farah, they're losing to soldiers." Later that afternoon, Astria stood at the back of a classroom, arms crossed, watching a group of recruits during a leadership simulation exercise. It was a test designed to expose decision-making under pressure, a blend of tactical scenarios, ethical dilemmas, and psychological stressors. What struck her wasn't who took charge, but how. A woman and a man shared command seamlessly, trading responsibilities mid-mission without ego or hesitation. Their dynamic was fluid, natural, unforced. It was a small thing, almost unremarkable, but to Astria it was monumental. This was what the fight had always been about. Not headlines, not hearings, not even plaques. It was about this, a generation of soldiers who didn't see us and them, only we. When the exercise ended, Orion joined her at the back of the room. His presence was quieter than Varric's had ever been, but no less commanding. "They're good," Astria said. "They're the best I've seen," Orion replied. "And it's not just the women. The men are stronger too, more adaptable, more disciplined. Turns out respect's a hell of a motivator." Astria smirked, who knew? Orion's expression sobered slightly. "I won't lie, there was pushback when you left. Some thought this would ruin the program, said we'd turn elite units into social experiments." "And now?" "Now," Orion said with a faint smile, "now those same people are fighting to get assigned here." That night, Astria sat alone in the officers' mess, nursing a cup of black coffee as rain tapped gently against the windows. She opened the leather-bound journal she'd carried through 3 deployments and countless missions. Inside were pages filled with notes, some tactical, some personal, documenting the slow, messy evolution of the military she loved. But one entry remained unfinished, the Roads Standard Future Recommendations. She stared at the blank space below it for a long time. Words didn't come easily anymore. She had spent so much of her life reacting to bias, to battles, to orders, that the act of envisioning something new felt foreign. What was the future? It wasn't just about women in combat. It wasn't just about integration. It was about building a force that reflected the reality of the world it protected, adaptable, diverse, relentless. It was about changing the definition of strength itself. She wrote slowly, deliberately. The enemy we face tomorrow will not be impressed by tradition. They will not be deterred by hierarchy. They will not care about gender. They will care only about capability. And so must we. 2 weeks later, Astria found herself thousands of miles from Fort Callister, standing on the tarmac of a forward operating base in the Middle East. Dust swirled around her boots as helicopters roared overhead, their rotors chopping the heat-thick air. This was no evaluation. This was a mission. Her team, a joint task force drawn from multiple branches, was assembling for a high-value extraction deep in hostile territory. The objective: recover an intelligence asset who had been tracking a growing insurgent network. And for the first time in U.S. military history, the team included 3 female operators in combat roles. One of them was Farah. "Feels different being here now, doesn't it?" Farah said, adjusting her gear as they prepared to load into the transport. "Not different," Astria replied, tightening the strap on her rifle. "Just overdue." Farah grinned. "I like that." As the helicopter lifted off, Astria looked out over the desert, the horizon a wavering line of gold and crimson. For years, the fight for integration had felt abstract, a policy debate, a cultural argument. But here, in the heart of a real-world mission, its purpose crystallized. This was why it mattered. Because strength wasn't theoretical, it wasn't political, it wasn't symbolic, it was operational, it was mission-critical. The insertion was swift and silent. Under the cover of night, the team slipped into the outskirts of a hostile-controlled village. Intel suggested the target was being held in a fortified compound guarded by a mix of militia fighters and foreign mercenaries. Astria's unit moved like water, precise, coordinated, lethal when necessary. Every operator, regardless of gender, had a role. Every role mattered. Halfway through the breach, a sudden change in the pattern, 2 unexpected patrols converging ahead. A rookie mistake could mean disaster. "2 hostiles, 9 o'clock, Farah whispered over comms. "Confirm," Astria replied. "We adapt. Bravo team shift entry point. Alpha hold position." The orders came fast, the responses faster. Within moments the plan had changed seamlessly, instinctively. And as the first shots cracked the night air, Astria realized something profound. They weren't just executing a mission. They were proving a doctrine. In the heat of real combat, no one cared who was male or female. No one cared who had once been underestimated. All that mattered was competence. All that mattered was trust. The mission ended before dawn. The asset was extracted safely. 0 casualties. Command would call it a textbook success. But for Astria, it was something deeper. It was proof that the fight had never been about inclusion for its own sake. It had been about building a stronger force, one capable of doing this. When the transport touched back down at the base, Astria stepped onto the tarmac with the first rays of sunrise breaking over the horizon. Farah walked beside her, sweat and dust streaking her face, eyes bright with exhausted pride. "Think anyone will ever really understand what today meant?" Farah asked quietly. Astria looked out across the desert, the sky awash in gold. "Maybe not, and maybe they don't have to. The people who need to understand they were on that helicopter." Farah nodded. "And the ones watching," Astria added softly, "are already learning." They stood there in silence for a moment, the dawn light catching the insignia on their uniforms. 2 soldiers bound not by gender, but by purpose. The mission was over, but the work was not. Because this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a future where strength looked different, where unity was forged not by sameness, but by shared sacrifice, where the next generation of warriors would never again have to prove that they belonged. Sometimes revolutions don't roar, they don't march, they don't declare themselves with banners or speeches. Sometimes they move quietly through the dark, execute their mission, and vanish before sunrise, leaving the world forever changed in their wake. Why did the silence of the desert feel louder than any explosion she'd ever heard? Captain Astria Roads crouched low behind a crumbling stone wall, the fine dust of the Middle Eastern night settling over her gear like a second skin. The village below, a maze of narrow alleys and flat-roofed homes, was deceptively quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that hummed beneath the skin, that warned seasoned operators something was wrong before the first shot ever fired. The mission had gone off-script hours ago. What was supposed to be a straightforward intelligence retrieval had spiraled into something far more dangerous. Their extraction point had been compromised, their asset was injured and unconscious, and an enemy quick reaction force was converging faster than anticipated. The plan, her plan, was now irrelevant. All that mattered was getting her team out alive. "Status check," Astria whispered into her comms, keeping her voice low and controlled. "Bravo team holding perimeter," came Lieutenant Ray's voice, steady but tight. "Movement on the North Ridge. 3 No. 4 vehicles, armed." "Copy." "Farah and I are securing the package," said Sergeant Latimer. "Vitals are weak but stable. We need exfil in the next 20. Astria exhaled slowly, scanning the rooftops for movement. 20 minutes. They didn't have 20. And yet beneath the tension, beneath the adrenaline, she felt it, that strange, familiar calm that always came when the stakes were life and death. It wasn't fear. It was focus. The same focus that had stared up from the mud at Fort Callister. The same focus that had outlasted ridicule, crushed arrogance, and reshaped a system that once refused to see her. Now it was the same focus that might be the only thing keeping 40 lives from being snuffed out in a foreign night. The firefight erupted without warning, a burst of gunfire from the western alley, muzzle flashes cutting through the dark. Astria ducked instinctively, returning fire with quick, controlled bursts. The air filled with the metallic tang of spent casings and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Contact left, Rays shouted. 2 down, more incoming." "Hold positions," Astria barked, moving from cover to cover with the fluid precision of years spent in combat zones. "We're not breaking." The enemy pressed hard, more coordinated than expected, more determined. They weren't just trying to repel them. They were trying to annihilate them. "Alpha team, fall back to secondary position," she ordered. "Bravo, prep for evac now." She felt the weight of command settle heavily on her shoulders, the invisible tether that bound every life here to her decisions. That weight had always been there, on every mission, in every firefight, but tonight it felt heavier. Because tonight she wasn't just fighting an enemy, she was fighting doubt. Doubt from those who had once said she didn't belong here. Doubt from policymakers who still questioned the value of integration. Doubt that whispered in the darkest corners of her mind, maybe they were right. But then she saw Farah's face streaked with sweat and grime, dragging the unconscious asset with every ounce of strength she had. She saw Latimer, barking orders with unshakable calm, trusting her judgment without hesitation. She saw a unit, her unit, moving as one. And the doubt went silent. "Birds 5 mics out," came the pilot's voice over comms. 5 minutes. They just had to hold for 5 more minutes. The enemy surged again, this time with technicals, pickups with mounted machine guns. Bullets tore through walls and ricocheted off stone. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed overhead, detonating in a plume of dust and shrapnel. Astria hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision swimming. "Captain, you hit," Rays shouted. "Negative," she grunted, pushing herself back to her feet. Her shoulder burned, but she ignored it. Pain was a luxury. Mission was priority. "Bravo, move the package," she yelled. "We're going to cover you." She and Rays took up flanking positions, laying down suppressive fire as Farah and Latimer hauled the asset toward the extraction zone. The radio crackled with overlapping reports, positions, ammunition counts, enemy movement, but Astria processed it all with surgical clarity. 3 mics. 2 minutes later, the distant thump of rotor blades grew louder. The extraction bird crested the horizon, floodlights cutting through the smoke and darkness. Relief surged through the team, short-lived but sharp. Then came the call Astria dreaded most. RPG lock. They've got a launcher near the courtyard. Find it, Astria shouted. I see its second floor, green building northwest, Farah's voice crackled. I've got the shot. Negative, Astria snapped. We don't risk it too exposed. Captain, if I don't take it, they'll hit the bird before we're clear. The decision hit like a punch. It was a no-win scenario, too risky to take the shot, too dangerous not to. The kind of choice that would haunt her either way. And yet deep down, she already knew the answer. Take it, she ordered. Farah broke cover, sprinting across open ground under a hail of fire. Astria's chest tightened as bullets bit into the dirt inches from her boots, as tracer rounds sliced the night around her. She reached her position, dropped prone, and lined up the shot. Clear shot, Farah breathed. Send it. The crack of her rifle echoed like thunder. A split second later, the RPG operator crumpled, the launcher clattering to the floor. Target down, bird is clear. The helicopter swooped in low, side door open, engine screaming. One by one, the team piled in Asset first, then Latimer, Reyes, Farah. Astria was last, laying down covering fire until the final second before leaping aboard. The bird lifted, banking hard as tracers streaked past the windows. And just like that, they were airborne, battered, exhausted, but alive. The debrief hours later was quiet, too quiet. The asset was stable, the mission was a success, but Astria knew what the report would say: compromised exfil, unexpected resistance, high-risk engagement. It would look clean on paper, but on the ground it had been anything but. As the team filed out of the briefing room, Farah lingered behind. You were right, she said softly. They weren't going to let us walk away. Astria gave a faint, tired smile. Neither were we. Farah hesitated. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Always. Back at Callister, I thought you were trying to prove something about women, about equality. But that's not what this is it? Astria shook her head. No, Farah, this isn't about proving we can. It's about proving that we must. That every ounce of talent, every kind of strength belongs in the fight. Farah nodded, eyes thoughtful. You think they'll understand that one day? Astria looked past her, out the window, where the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Maybe, maybe not, but they'll have to live in the world we build, not the one they remember. Weeks later, Astria was back in Washington, this time not in a hearing room but in a closed-door meeting with senior defense officials. Charts and graphs lined the walls. Integration metrics, mission performance data, recruitment trends. All of it pointed to the same conclusion: the experiment was working. But not everyone was convinced. Captain Rhodes, one admiral said, voice cool and measured, while your results are impressive, there are concerns about morale. Some units report friction, men unwilling to serve under female commanders, questioning orders. Then they're not soldiers, Astria interrupted, her tone calm but sharp. They're liabilities. A hush fell over the room. Respect is not optional in a combat zone, she continued. You don't have to like the person next to you, but you do have to trust them. And if you can't trust someone because of their gender, the problem isn't the system, it's you. There was no response. There didn't need to be. That night back in her apartment, Astria stood by the window overlooking the lights of the Capitol. The mission reports were stacked neatly on her desk. The commendations, the praise, the headlines, they all meant little. Because for every mission that proved the system was changing, there were 100 more battles still to fight. In the end, change wasn't a moment. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a standard carved into metal and mounted on a training field. Change was 1,000 small choices made every single day, in briefing rooms and on battlefields, in words spoken and silences broken. And sometimes, change was one soldier, muddy, bleeding, exhausted, refusing to stay down when the weight of the world pressed its boot against her back. Astria Roads knew that, she had lived it. And as she stared out into the night, the city lights reflecting off her medals, she whispered the same quiet promise she had made in the mud so long ago. "We're not finished yet." Why did the applause sound hollow? The Pentagon auditorium was packed, brass, policymakers, reporters, and aides filling every seat. Cameras lined the back wall, capturing every word as the Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium and announced a historic milestone. The Roads Integration Initiative had surpassed its first-year benchmarks. More women than ever were entering elite units. Attrition rates were down. Mission performance metrics were up. What had once been dismissed as an experiment was now official doctrine. The crowd clapped, smiled, nodded, but Astria Roads, standing at the edge of the stage in full dress uniform, felt none of the triumph the moment was supposed to bring. Because she had seen the reports they weren't showing. Because she had read the incident briefs buried under layers of bureaucratic language, words like noncompliance, disciplinary review, inappropriate conduct. Words that, stripped of euphemism, meant sabotage, resistance, hostility. Change, she knew, was never linear, but lately the pushback had grown teeth. And it was about to get personal. "Captain, you're going to want to see this." The voice belonged to Colonel Orion, his expression unusually tense as he placed a sealed dossier on Astria's desk later that afternoon. She opened it slowly, scanning the contents. Her jaw tightened as she read. 3 incidents in the last month, all in different units, all with the same pattern: female operators being deliberately set up to fail during training ops, equipment accidentally tampered with, mission intel withheld until the last second, orders deliberately miscommunicated. And then the most troubling detail. All 3 units were led by graduates of Fort Callister from before the Rhodes Standard. "This isn't random," Orion said quietly. "It's coordinated." "Sabotage." "Call it institutional rebellion," Orion replied. "They can't stop the change from the outside, so they're trying to poison it from within." Astria's hand tightened around the edge of the folder. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for it. But this wasn't just resistance, this was a message. And it was aimed at her. 2 weeks later, Astria stood in front of a group of instructors at Fort Harlan, one of the largest special operations training facilities in the country. The atmosphere in the briefing room was polite, but cold. Some offered forced smiles, others didn't bother. "Thank you for your time," Astria began, her voice calm but deliberate. "I'm here to conduct a readiness audit, not just on curriculum and performance, but on culture." A few men shifted in their seats. One, a grizzled major with decades in the field, crossed his arms. "With respect, Captain, we've been training operators long before this initiative came along, and we've done just fine." Astria met his gaze evenly. "And yet 3 of your recent graduates are under investigation for conduct unbecoming of a U.S. soldier." The room went still. "They didn't fail because they couldn't meet the standard," she continued. "They failed because they refused to accept that anyone else could." A younger lieutenant spoke up. "You're implying intent. Maybe these were just mistakes." 3 separate incidents across 3 different units," Astria said quietly. "That's not coincidence. That's a pattern." Silence, the kind that meant she was right and that they hated her for it. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she said finally. "I'm here to make sure the standard means something. If you're undermining it intentionally or otherwise, you're not just betraying your recruits, you're betraying your country." That night she found an envelope slipped under her door at the base housing unit. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper inside. "Stop pushing or someone gets hurt." She stared at the words for a long time, her pulse steady but her stomach heavy. It wasn't the first threat she'd received since becoming the face of the initiative, but this one felt different, more deliberate, more dangerous. She reported it, of course. Security protocols were enacted, investigations launched, but deep down, Astria knew how these things worked. The enemy wasn't some foreign adversary. It was a ghost living inside their own ranks, one that thrived in shadows, in whispered conversations and quiet acts of sabotage. And ghosts were hard to fight. Weeks passed. The threats didn't stop. Anonymous emails, slashed tires on a government vehicle, a training accident that coincidentally happened to involve a female operator under her mentorship. And then the unthinkable. Farah Isaacs, now a rising star in her unit, was hospitalized after a parachute malfunction during a high-altitude training jump. Investigators would later find that the harness had been tampered with. Astria sat by her bedside in the hospital, watching the steady rise and fall of Farah's chest beneath the oxygen mask. Her injuries were serious, but she would recover, physically at least. "I should have seen it coming," Astria whispered, guilt thick in her throat. "This isn't your fault," Latimer said quietly from the doorway. He'd flown in as soon as he heard. "Whoever did this, they're cowards, they're scared, and they should be." Astria's gaze stayed on Farah. "Scared people are dangerous." "Then make them more scared," Latimer replied. The next morning, Astria walked into a closed-door meeting with the Joint Special Operations Command. She didn't wait to be seated, didn't wait for permission. She dropped a stack of files onto the polished oak table with a heavy thud. "Here's the situation," she began. "Someone inside our ranks is actively sabotaging federal directives. They're endangering lives. They're undermining missions. And they're trying to make a mockery of everything we've built." "Captain Rhodes," an admiral started, "I understand your frustration, but—" "This isn't frustration," she cut in. "It's fact, and I'm not asking for permission to address it. I'm telling you that I will." A heavy pause followed. Then the Secretary of Defense, a man known for his calculated diplomacy, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A full internal task force," Astria said. "I want investigative authority, access to training records, operational logs, personnel files, everything. And I want it now." There was hesitation. There always was when bureaucracy collided with accountability. But eventually, the signatures came. The orders were signed. Project Sentinel was born. Within weeks, the task force began peeling back layers of resistance that had festered for years. What they uncovered was worse than Astria had feared. A network of senior officers and veteran instructors had been quietly coordinating efforts to undermine integration, sharing tactics, manipulating assessments, even sabotaging field ops. They called themselves the Purists. Their ideology was simple and poisonous. Elite units should remain male only, and if the system wouldn't protect that tradition, they would. The investigation led to dozens of arrests, forced retirements, and dishonorable discharges. Careers ended, reputations shattered, and for the first time in decades, the rot beneath the surface was dragged into the light. But the cost was high. Astria's name became a lightning rod for hatred. Online smear campaigns, congressional inquiries, accusations of witch hunts. Some called her a hero, others called her a traitor. And in quiet moments, when the noise faded and the spotlight dimmed, she sometimes wondered if they were both right. One night, months into Project Sentinel, Astria stood alone on the training field at Fort Callister. The plaque glinted softly in the moonlight. "Excellence knows no gender," the Rhodes standard. How many battles had been fought for those words? How many scars, sacrifices, sleepless nights, and how many more still lay ahead? "You're thinking too much," a familiar voice said. Farah approached slowly, leaning on a cane. She still walked with a slight limp, but her eyes burned with the same fire Astria had seen on the range years ago. "I should have protected you," Astria murmured. Farah shook her head. "You gave me something bigger than protection. You gave me purpose, and purpose is worth the risk." Astria's gaze lingered on the horizon. "They won't stop, you know, not completely." "Good," Farah said. "It means we're still pushing where it hurts." A long silence followed, broken only by the whisper of wind through the empty training ground. "Do you ever regret it?" Farah asked softly. "All of it?" Astria's answer came without hesitation. "Not once." Because change had never been about comfort. It had always been about friction, about challenging the world until it reshaped itself. It had always been about sacrifice, about enduring the weight of hatred so the next generation wouldn't have to. And as Astria stood beneath the stars, the same stars that had watched her crawl through mud and fire and doubt, she knew one thing with unshakable certainty. They hadn't built a program, they had built a movement. And movements don't stop. They evolve, they endure. And they outlast those who try to bury them. Why did victory feel so heavy? The headlines called it a triumph. News anchors spoke in polished tones about the historic dismantling of a toxic network within the armed forces. The Pentagon hailed Project Sentinel as one of the most sweeping internal reforms in modern military history. Panels on late-night shows debated its implications. Documentaries were already being drafted. But for Captain Astria Roads, sitting alone in a small, dimly lit office overlooking the Potomac, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. Stacks of reports littered her desk. Investigative files, court-martial transcripts, letters, some from grateful recruits thanking her for opening doors they never thought they'd walk through, others from veterans calling her a disgrace, a destroyer of tradition. The war she'd fought had not been waged in trenches or mountains or city streets. It had been fought in boardrooms, classrooms, and the hidden corners of institutions that had once felt untouchable. And like every war, it had left casualties, some visible, most not. And it wasn't over. Because change never truly ended. It only shifted battlefields. "Captain Rhodes," the voice snapped her from her thoughts. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne stepped into the office, closing the door quietly behind him. His face, always unreadable, was softer tonight. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was worry. Perhaps both. "You've done more in 2 years than most officers do in a lifetime," he said, dropping a folder onto her desk. "But this next one, this is going to be harder." Astria raised an eyebrow. "Harder than dismantling a conspiracy." Thorne nodded. "Because this one isn't about enemies, it's about ghosts." She opened the folder. Inside were personnel files, not of those who had opposed her, but of those who had supported her. Operators, commanders, instructors, men and women who had embraced the road's standard and built their careers on it. And nearly all of them were leaving. "Voluntary discharges," Thorne said. "Burnout, PTSD, family strain, and a few just can't carry the weight anymore." Astria's chest tightened. "They shouldn't have to." "They shouldn't," Thorne agreed. "But they do, because the fight doesn't end when the policy changes. It keeps grinding, and it grinds hardest on the ones who believe in it the most." Astria stared down at the files. These weren't names on paper, they were people. People who had fought beside her, believed in her mission, risked everything for it. People now quietly fatting out of the system they'd sacrificed so much to change. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar crawl beneath her ribs. Doubt. Had they won the battle but lost the soldiers? A week later, Astria visited one of the integration programs on the West Coast, a pilot unit designed to blend operators from multiple branches into one cohesive force. It was the future she had always envisioned: diverse, adaptive, lethal. But the atmosphere was off. The drills were sharp, the recruits disciplined, But beneath the precision, something felt brittle, a tension she couldn't quite name. During a Q&A session, a young female candidate raised her hand, hesitation flickering in her eyes. "Ma'am," she began carefully, "how do you know if you're here because you're good enough, or because they need someone like you here?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Astria took a slow breath before answering. "The truth," she said, "you'll never know, not fully, and maybe that's part of the burden we carry, not to prove ourselves to them but to ourselves." The recruit nodded, but Astria saw the doubt still lingering, and she knew that doubt because she'd carried it herself once. Later in the mess hall, she overheard a group of male candidates speaking in hushed tones. "Quota higher. Wouldn't last a week without political cover. Can't even do the 12-mile ruck without collapsing." She didn't interrupt, she didn't chastise, she simply listened and remembered. This was the next battle, not against overt hostility or institutional sabotage. This was subtler, more insidious. It wasn't shouted, it was whispered, it wasn't policy, it was perception. And it was harder to kill than any conspiracy. That night she called Farah. "How's the leg?" Astria asked. "Stronger," Farah replied. "Doctor says I'll be back in the field by next quarter, not that they're thrilled about it." "You shouldn't rush it." "I'm not rushing," Farah said. "I'm choosing big difference." Astria smiled faintly. "I envy your certainty." Farah was quiet for a moment. "You're doubting yourself again, aren't you?" "Wouldn't you?" Astria sighed. "We broke the system open, but look around, the resistance didn't die. It just evolved. Now it's in the way people look at them, at us, at what we represent." "You didn't expect to erase centuries of bias in a couple of years, did you?" Farah asked. "No, but I hoped," Astria trailed off. "I hoped it would feel like progress." "It is progress," Farah said gently. "Just not the kind that gives you medals or headlines. It's the kind that grows quietly, the kind that happens one choice, one soldier, one mission at a time." Astria let out a slow breath. "Maybe that's the hardest part." "It always is," Farah said. "Change isn't a switch, Astria, it's a tide, and tides take time." Weeks later, Astria was summoned to Capitol Hill again, this time behind closed doors. The room was filled with senior officials, many of whom had opposed her work from the beginning. "Captain Rhodes," one senator began, "there are concerns that the Rhodes Standard is creating division within the ranks. Some argue that morale has declined, that traditional cohesion has been undermined." Astria didn't flinch. Cohesion built on exclusion isn't cohesion, it's convenience. A murmur rippled through the room, but she pressed on. "The purpose of this initiative was never to make people comfortable. It was to make them capable. If morale suffers because we are asking soldiers to see beyond their own prejudice, then morale is the problem, not the mission." The room fell silent. No one spoke. When she left the hearing, reporters swarmed her. Some shouted questions about division, others about political correctness. Astria answered none of them. Because she knew the truth. If they were debating, it meant they were paying attention. And if they were paying attention, it meant they couldn't ignore her anymore. The following month, Astria was deployed again, this time as an advisor on a joint NATO task force responding to a rapidly escalating crisis in Eastern Europe. It was a tense, volatile operation. Multiple nations, competing priorities, fragile alliances. And yet, as she walked into the command center and scanned the faces around the table, men and women from 6 countries, some in their 20s, others with decades of service, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. No one questioned her presence. No one asked why she was there. No one used words like quota or experiment. They listened when she spoke. They debated her strategies. They trusted her experience. It wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was different, and that difference mattered. After the operation concluded successfully, Astria stood alone on a windswept balcony overlooking the Black Sea. The moon hung low and silver over the dark water. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. In the distance, she could see the silhouettes of soldiers, men and women, moving together, working together, planning together. It wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even the middle. It was another chapter, one she had fought for, bled for, sacrificed for. She thought of the mud at Fort Callister, of the boot pressing down on her shoulder, of the laughter, of the silence, of the salute that had changed everything. And she thought of the words engraved on that plaque, the words that had become a promise to an entire generation. Excellence knows no gender. It wasn't just a motto anymore. It was a reality, imperfect, fragile, still growing, but real. And in that moment, for the first time since the fight began, Astria Roads allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. Because the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she believed they could win it. Sometimes the hardest wars aren't fought against enemies. They're fought against inertia, against prejudice, against the ghosts of what once was. And sometimes the greatest victories don't come with fanfare or fireworks. They come quietly in the way people walk together, fight together, believe together. Sometimes the most profound change doesn't roar, it whispers. And yet its echo can shake the foundations of the world. Why did the air feel different that morning, lighter, almost reverent, as if the wind itself understood what was about to happen? Captain Astria Roads stood on the edge of the parade ground at Fort Callister, the very soil that had once tried to bury her now firm beneath her boots. The rising sun cast a golden glow across the horizon, painting long, reaching shadows over the rows of recruits assembled before her. Their uniforms were crisp, their postures perfect, their eyes focused, but the energy in the air was unlike anything she had felt here before. There was no mockery, no condescension, no whispers that questioned who did or didn't belong. This was no longer the same ground where a general had once pressed her into the mud to prove a point. It wasn't the same field where sneers and laughter had followed her every step. It wasn't even the same institution that had once believed excellence came in only one shape, one size, one gender. This was something else entirely. And Astria, after years of battles fought in silence and storms weathered in the shadows, had finally allowed herself to believe it. "Captain Rhodes," Colonel Orion said quietly, stepping beside her. He was older now, the streaks of gray in his hair more pronounced, but his presence was steady as ever. "They're ready." "Are we?" she asked softly. Orion smiled faintly. "We're better than we've ever been." Astria nodded, her gaze sweeping across the formation. There were hundreds of them, the latest generation of recruits about to embark on one of the most grueling, elite programs in the military. And for the first time in history, they stood at perfect parity. Men and women, shoulder to shoulder, united not by demographics but by discipline. She stepped forward, and the formation snapped to attention. "Recruits," she began, her voice carrying across the field, strong and steady. "I've stood on this ground before in this very place, and I remember what it felt like to be underestimated." The words hung in the air, heavy but deliberate. "I remember the looks, the jokes, the assumptions. I remember being told I didn't belong here. And I remember the weight of someone else's boot pressing me into the mud, trying to grind away everything I was." A ripple moved through the formation. Some recruits shifted, others clenched their jaws, all of them listened. "I also remember standing back up." Her voice softened, not weaker, just deeper. "And I remember what happened after. Not the humiliation, not the pain, but the moment when everything changed, not because I fought harder, but because I refused to give up. Because I believe that strength isn't determined by who doubts you. It's determined by who you decide to become." The wind caught her words and carried them down the rows, across the field, beyond the base walls, perhaps even beyond the borders of the world she'd spent her life trying to change. Every one of you will be tested here, she continued. Not just physically, but mentally. Not just as soldiers, but as people. You'll be pushed past limits you didn't know existed. And when you reach the edge of who you think you are, you'll have a choice. Stay down or stand back up. Her gaze swept across the faces before her. Faces that, for the first time, reflected the full spectrum of the force they served. And if you choose to stand, she said, it won't be for me. It won't be for the name on your uniform. It will be for the soldier next to you. It will be for the mission. It will be for something far greater than yourself. Silence followed, not empty but full, the kind of silence that carries weight. Welcome to the next chapter, she said quietly. Welcome to the standard. The ceremony that followed was brief but powerful. Awards were presented. Speeches were made. A new cohort was officially inducted into the most elite fighting force in the world. And when it was over, Astria stayed behind, long after the crowds had dispersed and the last salute had been rendered. She walked slowly across the training ground, every step carrying her deeper into memory. She could still see it, the mud, the circle of recruits, the sneer on General Varick's face. She could still hear the taunts, feel the sting of humiliation. And she could still feel the weight of that moment when she had chosen not to fight back but to rise. That choice had changed everything. It had changed policy, it had changed culture, it had changed lives. But more than anything, it had changed her. "Ma'am." The voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see a young woman standing at attention a few paces away. Barely 19, maybe 20, fresh from basic training. Her uniform was immaculate, but there was a tremor in her posture, the unmistakable mix of fear and determination Astria had seen 1,000 times before. "Permission to speak freely?" the recruit asked. "Granted," Astria said. "My mom served here," the young woman said. "She was one of the first. She used to tell me stories about how hard it was, about the things people said, about the walls she couldn't break down." Astria nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "And yet here you are." "Yes, ma'am," the recruit said, her voice trembling slightly. "Because she told me that one day someone would come along and make sure I wouldn't have to fight the same battles she did." It took Astria a moment to respond. Her throat felt tight. "And what do you think?" she asked finally. The recruit's answer was simple. "I think you're the reason I'm here." Astria didn't reply. She didn't need to. The weight of those words was more than enough. Months later, Astria found herself in a place she had never imagined. A classroom. Not a combat briefing room, not a war council, not a battlefield. A classroom. She had been asked to lecture at the War College, not about tactics or weapons or strategy, but about leadership, about culture, about resilience, and about the invisible battles that shape the visible ones. She stood before a room filled with future generals and admirals, people who would shape the next century of military policy. She spoke not about medals or missions, but about mud, about silence, about the choices that define character. "When I was pressed into the ground," she told them, "it wasn't the insult that stayed with me. It was the moment I realized that dignity doesn't beg for recognition. It doesn't demand respect. It simply acts." Her words were met with silence, the good kind. The kind that meant they were listening, really listening. And as she left the lecture hall that day, she knew that the seeds she had planted would continue to grow long after she was gone. Years passed. Astria Roads retired quietly without ceremony or fanfare. She declined promotions. She turned down public office. She ignored book deals and documentary offers. She didn't want her story to become a brand. She wanted it to remain what it had always been, a lesson. And yet, even in retirement, her influence was everywhere. At Fort Callister, the Rhodes Standard wasn't just a motto. It was doctrine, embedded into every lesson plan, every training manual, every field op. At the Pentagon, her assessments were required reading for senior leadership. In units across the world, soldiers, men and women alike, quoted her words without even knowing where they had come from. And on the training ground where she had once been pushed into the mud, a new generation of recruits still knelt, still rose, still learned what strength truly meant. On a clear spring morning many years later, Astria visited Fort Callister one last time. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her gait slower, but her eyes were the same, sharp, focused, unyielding. She walked alone to the plaque at the edge of the field, brushing her fingers over the engraved words that had come to define an era. Excellence knows no gender, the Rhodes standard. A group of young recruits jogged past, laughing and shouting, the sound of their boots beating rhythmically against the earth. Astria watched them go, a faint smile tugging at her lips. They didn't know her story. They didn't know the mud, the humiliation, the fight. They didn't need to. All they needed to know was that they were here and that they belonged. She turned her face to the wind, closed her eyes, and let the memories wash over her one last time. The mud, the silence, the laughter, the salute, the hearing, the missions, the sacrifices, the legacy. All of it had led to this. Not fame, not glory, but change. And as the sun climbed higher over the horizon, Astria Roads, soldier, officer, warrior, builder, walked slowly away from the field that had once defined her. She didn't look back, she didn't need to, because she knew the truth now. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't shout. They don't demand to be seen. They don't even ask for recognition. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And when it does, it doesn't just change a life. It changes the world.